All right, we are going to try this again. I'm not sure what happened with the sound. My apologies for that. So, once again, good evening. I'm Elaine Ellis Thomas. I'm the rector of All Saints Episcopal Parish in Hoboken, New Jersey. And we are here to have a conversation about raising anti-racist kids.
All right, we are going to try this again. I'm not sure what happened with the sound. My apologies for that. So, once again, good evening.
Okay. Can you hear me still? Okay, so I just turned my sound off. Hopefully that'll work. We won't get that feedback. So once again, my apologies. We are here to talk about an issue that obviously has gotten a lot of attention, particularly recently in our country. There have been many times in my life that it seemed that things were about to change, that racism and white supremacy had become as intolerable for white people as for black people. And up to now, most Americans have just gone back to what was comfortable and simply didn't push through their own discomfort and the reality that in order for things to change for blacks in America, things have to change for us, and we have to make that change happen. This time seems different. It feels different. The level of violence perpetrated against African Americans in this country is unconscionable. The recent highly publicized deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Tony McDade, David McAtee, Elijah McClain. It's a relentless stream of police and vigilante killing of black men and women, and it has finally awakened us. At least that is my hope. And I am in, as I often say, the hope business. As we adults push and advocate and insist on change at all levels of government, public safety, and policy, we need to make sure that we're sharing this with our children, helping them understand that we don't live in a colorblind society, but in one that bases human value on skin color. We seem to believe that talking to children about race will make them notice race, will make them racist. But our kids are absorbing messages about race whether we point them out or not. Better for us to help them understand those messages, to empower them, to make them agents of change. But how do we do that? Most of us did not have models of woke parenting growing up. How do you explain a police killing to a child? How do you explain the pent-up rage that has spilled into our streets and our communities? What can a 3-year-old understand about white supremacy? Well, we're here to talk through all of this, and I have 3 women who I know to be doing this work with their children. As it said in the publicity for this event, none of us would describe ourselves as experts, but they are working at it, and I believe we can all learn from that. So I want to introduce you. First of all, Allison Sandlin Lyles is an Episcopal priest living in Dallas, Texas. She's the mother of 2. She serves as priest in charge at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Hurst, Texas, is an editor of Grow Christians, an online community that helps parents foster faith at home, and is the former executive director of Episcopal Peace Fellowship. Welcome, Allison. Next, we have Emily Rutledge, who lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. She lives there with her spouse and 2 kids. She is the minister for children, youth, and families at the Episcopal Church of Our Savior. And as Allison told me, she speaks teenager like nobody's business. So welcome, Emily. Finally, Audrey Trusky is an author, historian, and activist who is also an associate professor of South Asian history at Rutgers University. She's also the mother of 3 young children, and she's a member of my congregation. So welcome, Audrey. Before I ask my first question, I want to encourage those who are watching, use the chat feature on YouTube to ask us questions. At the end of our conversation, we'll get to as many of those as we're able to. Finally, I want to say that you can't have helped but notice that we are all white women on this panel this evening, taking part in this conversation, and that is intentional. This is our work. White people created and perpetuate white supremacy, and it's our work to dismantle it. Also, the conversation a Black mother has with her child about racism is a different conversation. It's one that helps prepare children for the racism that they will encounter, rather than this conversation, which is about naming and dismantling the privilege we have as white people. To include a Black parent here would set up an expectation that she would have answers for us. It's not fair, and it absolves us of the work that we need to do. So at some point, I would love to have a conversation with people of color, with Indigenous parents, with Latinx, with immigrants. But for now, this is a conversation between white moms. In a recent podcast with Austin Channing Brown, sociologist Brene Brown said that she wanted to get it right, not to be right. I think that's a pretty good goal. So with all of that said, we're going to begin. So the first thing that I've asked my panelists to consider or to talk about is a little bit about where you're coming from, what your background is, what kind of conversations about race, if any, did you have when you grew up? Where are you from? Was it a topic of conversation, or was it something that your family ignored or tried to ignore? Did you come from a multicultural environment? Did you have Black friends growing up? That sort of thing. So knowing that Allison comes from a state that begins with the letter A, I'm going in alphabetical order. So Allison, you get to answer that one first if you'd like to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Thanks, Elaine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I grew up in Alabama, and
I can't hear her.
I think Elaine is still muted, and so she doesn't hear me. Her volume's turned down. So I grew up in Alabama, and
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, Elaine, we're getting your feedback again now too.
Elaine is still muted, and so she doesn't hear me. Okay. Her volume's down.
There eventually. So I grew up in Alabama, and I think that I was raised in a household that resembled most middle-class white households in the town where I grew up in North Alabama. The idea was that, at least what I picked up on, was that racism was fixed in the 60s. And so we didn't need to talk about it anymore. And so we didn't. And my house, it wasn't so much that we were being taught to be colorblind, even. It was just that Black was more of a bad word. And if we pointed out someone's skin color, we were shushed, which now I know now as an adult, which teaches the person with the Black skin that it's something that they should be ashamed of if we're not even supposed to talk about it. So anytime I had questions about it, or my sister had questions, I just remember the conversation being shut down. Either it was redirected or a joke was made, which is my family addresses most serious things with humor. And so it was left without any concrete answers. And it wasn't that the questions I was asking was inappropriate or inaccurate. It was just that we weren't met with the truth. And so we were left to have our own answers. I remember being at a third grade brownie sleepover and wondering what my friend Rika's feet were going to look like when she took her socks off to go to sleep in the Girl Scout Little House, because I had never seen Black feet before. And that wasn't something that I knew that I could ask my parents about. Our doorbell's ringing, sorry. So I think that our house was full of, I would say, microaggressions, just a lot of comments about wealth or lack of wealth or perceived violence, a lot of it based on skin color. And that's what we were hearing from everybody. It was reinforced at school, and it was reinforced at friends' houses. It wasn't something that was just happening in my house. I grew up in a town where literally a railroad track divided the city. And most of the people of color, whether it was brown or Black skin, lived across the railroad tracks, and it was the bad neighborhood. It's where the crime happened, and it's where the houses were more disheveled, and it's where the bad schools were. So all of this was reinforced without having to come from my parents. It was something that we were just picking up from our surroundings. Yeah, I think that's about all that I have.
Okay. Okay, we can mute that for a minute. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Allison. I appreciate that. I'm doing a little sound lag here, so it took me a minute to realize you were done. Thank you for answering that. Emily, how about you? Tell us a little bit about your context, how you're growing up, and what kind of environment helped form you.
I was frozen. Internet is really doing great today. I am from Hawaii, so I grew up in a totally different world when it came to race, but with a lot of things that were the same. So in Hawaii, there are not a lot of Black people that are from Hawaii. I had one Black friend growing up that I was close with all the way through school, but my family is diverse. So I have Korean and Hawaiian cousins, and we are a lot of different things. They call Hawaii the melting pot. So most people are multiple ethnicities. So there's a lot of pride in being multiple ethnicities. The fact that I was just white was kind of boring. And I was a little sad about that growing up because my cousins were multiple things. But I definitely also experienced the reality of living in a state that had been colonized and whitewashed in a lot of ways recently. So in Hawaii, there's a big push for Hawaiian homelands and reparations and things that we are speaking of as a nation now, but as a state, we're very important to the Hawaiian people. And I went to a high school that was founded by a queen. So the monarchy and things like that were a big part of the culture. My history lessons, as now I'm an adult, realized I didn't learn about American history. I learned about Hawaiian history. So I'm needing to learn a lot now that I didn't know growing up about the Civil War. And it was touched upon, but we delved deep into Hawaiian history growing up. And my family talked about race, but it wasn't Black, white. It was definitely Native, Indigenous peoples, and colonizers. And that was very much the conversations we had. And we were aware of what was happening on the mainland, but it didn't seem important to us. And as I said that to us, I'm talking about my white family. So no one in my family was Black. One of my very closest friends in high school is Black. And as I look back on the ways that we just like obsessed on her hair and like all of the things that now I'm like, oh my gosh, like what were we doing? And she had no peers in that and no community to support her in that. And it's something that I've kind of gone back and looked at. So growing up in Hawaii was a different world. I am thankful that I don't have, I'm not afraid to talk about race. I'm not afraid to talk about a lot of things. So that might just be my personality. But in Hawaii, it's really important that you know what people are and you honor it. So I went to a school that was mostly first generation Asian. It was an all girls school. And you need to know if someone was Korean or Japanese or Chinese. Like it was important that you knew what country they came from. And I realized that my Black friends don't have the access to that information and they long to, but it was so critical that we knew where people came from because it mattered. And that's something as an adult now, I stand beside the mourning of my friends who don't have access to that culture that they wish they had more of a tie to. And we moved to Virginia 10 years ago. So my spouse and I are both from Hawaii. It's a big change. So we're learning a lot about what it is like to live in a place that is in some ways still very segregated, in a town that likes to pretend it's very woke, but is not as woke as we want to believe.
Thank you so much for that, Emily. That's a unique background, a little bit different than Allison and me, who both grew up in the South. And now, Audrey, you are a Midwesterner. Why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Thanks, and thanks, Elaine, for putting this together, for asking me to be a part of it. So I grew up in sort of the white suburbs, first the suburbs of Chicago, and then midway through my childhood, we moved to the suburbs of Kansas City, Missouri. And, you know, almost everyone I knew was white. You know, I graduated in a high school class of 375 students. I'm not exactly sure how many Black students there were, but it was single digits. And I think it was low single digits. And growing up, I don't recall race being a subject of much discussion at school, among my friends, or within my family, and within the house. And because of that, when I left Missouri and went to college at the age of 17 and basically never went back, you know, like as I sort of grew up in college and thereafter, it took me a lot of years and a lot of time to be comfortable talking about race and asking questions. You know, there was part of it was that I was afraid of getting it wrong, and part of it was, you know, I was afraid of saying the wrong things, and part of it was just that I lacked any sort of discourse or vocabulary for talking about racial inequality and white privilege and white supremacy and all and these sorts of concepts. And looking back, that's what I think part of what motivates me to talk to my kids and to try to teach them about it, is that I don't think it should have taken into my 20s for me to even be able to talk about this stuff, right? There's no reason to not be able to develop that vocabulary much younger. You know, and I sort of wish that I had that. So that's where I sort of come from on this.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So now I just want to fast forward a little bit to where you are now and how race plays into either the work that you do or where you live. I mean, what's the community like where you are? Is it still or is it still mostly white? Do you live in a multicultural area? What in what space are you raising your kids? I think, and the kind of work that you do, does that intersect with any of this, trying to dismantle white supremacy, or at least to give some attention to matters of race? And so why don't we start, Emily, why don't you start off with this one?
Sure. So I'm living in Central Virginia, and I live out in Crozet, which is a suburb of Charlottesville. As most of us know, the Unite the Right rally happened here a few years ago, and it has rattled and awoken the complacency in me, and I think in a lot of white people in our town. I am a minister at a white church, and we're trying to do some work centering around our whiteness. Not that we hope Black people will come to our church, which is kind of a hurdle we've worked on, as hoping to, well, if we can all just go to church together, you know, we can all just be friends, that's going to fix this problem. My children are at a school that is led by a Black woman. So their principal is a Black woman. And that has been intentional in terms of, we moved recently, but stayed within our school district because that's critical for my partner and I when it comes to raising our kids, is having people in power that are not white. And for me, that my children know that a Black woman basically runs their life. Like, that's the most important person in the world to them. That's who they want to please. That's who makes the decisions that matter to them. It's been really big for us. And I have a few really close friends who are Black in my community. And we're going to talk later, but I've failed with them, and they've let me fail and given me the space and grace to do that. But right now, the work I'm doing Some of it is small. It's talking to my kids and being really honest. I'm trying to be more aware. I just think of small things that I didn't recognize. So yesterday I went to our local grocery store and there was a car behind me. I have a picture if anyone would like to see it. And I took a picture because this person on the back of his truck, it said like liberal something are ruining my life. I don't know if he was trying or ruining your life, YER. And I don't know if it was ruining or running, same point, but I was like, oh, it was like one of those moments. And as I walked in, one of the people that works there, it's like an 18-year-old Black kid, he's cleaning the carts and he pulls out his phone and Snapchat to take a picture of the same truck. And I said, I just took a picture of that truck. And he said, yeah, that guy has a Confederate flag tattoo on his arm. And last week he came up to me and said, do you like my tattoo? And it was this moment, and I had my children there, and I just looked at this boy, I mean, he's a teenage boy, and I was like, I'm sorry, like, that sucks. Like, what a jerk. And he's like, yeah. And we just had this small conversation and walked in, and my kids were like, do you know him? And I'm like, no, but like, here's the situation. Like, you know what's going on. All of those things are against him. And it's those little moments that normally I would have been like, don't make eye contact. He probably feels uncomfortable. Don't make him more uncomfortable. I'm really trying to see people because I hate confrontation and I hate feeling uncomfortable. I hate feeling like I'm going to do something wrong. So often in the past, and I still am pushing against this, I would rather do nothing than make someone mad at me because I hate anyone being mad at me. And I'm learning that that's not people are going to be mad at me if I'm doing the right thing. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. It's a very segregated community. And my husband works somewhere that it is segregated in that the white people work inside and the Black people work outside. So as a family, we're trying to do some work on how we step into that. So a lot of noticing, but Charlottesville does seem to be the center of a lot right now. And so creating space and showing up to things like rallies that matter, just to be a support for the Black community.
Thank you, Emily, for that. Audrey, tell us about Hoboken, New Jersey.
So Hoboken is an interesting place, but let me actually begin with where I work, which is in Newark, New Jersey. So I teach at Rutgers University in Newark, and Rutgers University Newark is the most diverse college in the entire United States. So which is awesome, right? It's a huge perk of the job. And right, like there's just every kind of person looking every which way, doing every which thing on campus. It's super cool. It's a super exciting place to be because of that. And one sort of effect that has had is I think it has really heightened my awareness of race and prejudice and bias and the possibility for that to enter the classroom and what many of my students face in the world and so on and so forth. So when I'm at work, this is constantly on my mind. I also happen to teach about prejudice and bias to some degree. I regularly teach about anti-Muslim sentiments and Islamophobia in particular. And I teach about more general, sort of bias and racial stuff as well. Then when I come home in Hoboken has diversity, but not as much diversity, certainly not as much as Newark. And so I look at my kids, who are white, and many of their friends, not all of them, but many of their friends are white. And I sometimes think we could just not talk about race, right? We don't have to, I mean, the superintendent of our schools is a Black woman. Yes. And that's great. Love her. but I don't think we have to talk about it. And again, that's actually something that motivates me, is the knowledge that if I am not proactive about talking to my kids, that I could just repeat the sins of prior generations, right? And raise children that are once again, uncomfortable and unaware of, what they're doing to further racism, and are unwilling to confront it and sort of exist in that space of discomfort. So, I think we have some stuff going in Hoboken. But I think that we really do have to be proactive about raising the subject. So.
Thanks, Audrey. So I'm going to stay with you, actually. The next part of this conversation is really the heart of the conversation, which is, what are we doing? What are you doing? How are you raising your children? How are you teaching your children? And one of the reasons I asked each of you is because I've seen or know of things that you are doing. And Audrey, since I know you, you're a member of my congregation, and I've seen how you have your kids were at the recent George Floyd protests in Hoboken with their little signs and handing out water outside the church. So I know that you're doing the work, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you go about that, because if you could tell us how old your kids are, and then because yours are younger than Allison's and Emily's, and I think it's helpful for parents to know that even with really young kids, there are ways that you can begin to have these conversations.
Sure, absolutely. So my kids are ages 6, 4, and 2. And I can't say we're doing much with the 2-year-old, right? Like, we're just keeping him alive. That's my general goal with him right now. But for the 4 and the 6-year-old, there is a lot you can do, right? I mean, study after study has shown that by the age of 3, certainly 4, kids see race, they see color. So they're seeing it whether you talk to them or not. So you better talk to them, because otherwise they're doing what Allison described from her childhood, which is imbibing all the bad stuff, right? And all the prejudice. So I talk to my kids about race, and I take them to protests. And, so with the recent, Black Lives Matter stuff, I told them about the killing of George Floyd. And I described it in sort of straightforward language, that a policeman, pressed on his neck until he couldn't breathe, and then he died. And, kids can handle stuff like that, in my opinion. Generally as a parent, I'm in favor of giving a pretty unvarnished view of the world, and, teaching them how to handle it, adversity and difficult things. I told them about some of the other killings, and then they ask questions, and sometimes the questions are immediate, but honestly, more often they're not immediate. And at least my kids, they're always like circling back to stuff. And that's something that I think is actually very discomforting as a parent. So maybe a week after I first told them about the George Floyd killing, I was walking down the street with my 4 and 6-year-old, and my 4-year-old was on this like tangent of questions, as 4-year-olds do, So, mommy, who made the sidewalks? People. Mommy, how did they make them? They poured concrete. Mommy, where did the concrete come from? I have no idea. Mommy, why did the police officer kill the Black man? And it's like, as an adult, that's heart stopping, right? Because, we were talking about concrete, right? And now we're talking about something, like super serious. And obviously we're out in public. So, I mean, who knows who's going to overhear what sort of, crazy, bungled, mistaken answer that I'm going to give, in an off the cuff question like this. But, I answer as best I can, and I try to get them to, think about the consequences. And, one other thing I'll add, one thing that happens with my kids is that they make it personal. So I tell them about something that happened. Policeman killed a Black man. And then they will start asking, or going back further, when the child separation stuff started with ICE, we described that to them. And I vividly remember my then not even 4-year-old asking, Mommy, are the police going to come take me away from you and Daddy? And I explained that no, they're not, because we're American citizens and we have white skin and white privilege, not using that language, but how that protects us. And then she started asking about all of their friends by name who have darker skin. is this going to happen to them? Is this going to happen to them? And I think that's a very difficult thing because it can be very emotionally trying for children to think about that. And it's hard to answer as a parent and introduce even further nuance. But I think that it's important, right? Because that's the seeds of empathy right there, is realizing that even though we don't know anyone of color who a policeman has ever killed, someone knew every single one of these murder victims, right? And that, that's part of what we want to, at least I want to communicate to my children, is to think about it and value each death and each life in that way.
Wow. Thank you, Audrey, for that. Allison, I neglected the first question to ask you question number 2. So you get a little bit of time here to talk a bit about where you are, the work you're doing, kind of what your neighborhood's like and where you're raising your children, and then talk a little bit about how you are helping your kids to be more aware of these issues. I will remark that a lot of what I see of you comes from either in your writing or social media, and I see and hear the things that you are doing, and some of that you share from time to time, conversations that you have with your children. And I'm thinking of particularly recently of something that that a program your son was watching on TV, or a video that he remarked on the lack of people of color in the context in which he was watching. So if you would speak to that,
Yeah.
that would be great.
Thanks. And I think that both the question that I didn't answer before and what we're doing now definitely intersect. So I think this will roll into one. So both of our kids were born in Alabama, and my husband married into Alabama when he married me. He's not a Southerner. And when our oldest was only about 18 months old, his godfather is Black. And he was at daycare, and I went to go pick him up, and there was a Black dad there picking up his child. And his godfather's name is Ewert, which was too hard for him to say. So he just called him E. And he started pointing to this Black man saying, E, 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 E. The man thought he was making a monkey sound. And since we were in Alabama, it wasn't that far-fetched of an idea. And at that point I realized, like, he doesn't understand there are other Black people in the world, really, except for his godfather. And so, like, really at that point he was 18 or 20 months old. And like, that's when we started to really address it. I'll talk about this in a little bit later, but we started with a colorblind approach, which we have like rewound and done a little differently. But like Audrey, we believe that everything can be talked to at an age appropriate level. All subjects are up for discussion with our kids. And because I did so much work with gun violence prevention with Episcopal Peace Fellowship, we started talking about gun violence and school shootings and police shootings when they were really, really little. And I remember when Tamir Rice was killed, my son was in kindergarten. And so we talked about it in terms of like why we don't play with toy guns. But then, like, what happens, like when you're 12 and police think that you're older because you have Black skin, you're not given the benefit of the doubt. Like if my son was out playing with a toy gun. So we started talking about race then. We were in a very, very, very white town where there was a lot of racial diversity, economic diversity, but not racial diversity. And nothing, like there was no racial integration at all. And then we moved to Dallas almost 3 years ago. And I was really excited because it was the first urban place that our kids would have ever lived, and had really high hopes for living in this very integrated city. And then I got here and realized it's not. Like there's a bunch of religious diversity, but our neighborhood is very middle class and very, very white. And there are a handful of kids of color in their classes, but there's only one person of color, a Latina woman who teaches at the school, but all the other teachers, and it is a huge elementary school, and they are all white. And so I realized when we moved here that we had to be intentional about seeking out diversity for them. And so from the podcasts that we listen to the books that they're reading, the books that I'm reading, and the shows that we can do better with television shows. That's been harder. But the movies they're watching, the camps they go to, the like basketball leagues that they join, we have tried to get outside of our community for all of those so that they're playing with kids who look different than them. We're trying to normalize and decentralize whiteness in all of the subjects of like the fun stuff that they're soaking up, like books and podcasts and movies. And then like now that my son is 11, my oldest, we're reading hard books. And so we read To Kill a Mockingbird, which I know is hard. A lot of people are not reading that anymore. As an Alabamian, I didn't feel like I had a choice. And we read it, but we stopped all the time to talk about like Calpurnia code switching or Atticus as the white savior. And I was reading aloud to him so I could adjust some of the language, which is important. And then we just finished Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped, the Jason Reynolds remix version for a YA group. And we both learned a lot. And because of that, we had the conversation with Troop Beverly Hills, which is one of our summer movie list, which is what Elaine was just referencing. And I mean, we really weren't even 5 minutes into the movie. And then my son says, Mom, did you notice that all the white people are all the rich people in Beverly Hills and all the black people work for them? Black and brown people work for them. Like, yeah, I noticed that. And I'm glad you did, so it's this idea that we can't fix a problem until we name it. And so we're trying to name it as often as we can. So we've talked about how racism and slavery has evolved. We talk about mass incarceration, even though my kids are 9 and 11. That we have hard things. Today, my daughter listened to a podcast about Josephine Brooks and was learning about a Black woman who, she said she'd been in castles all over the world. And then when she was back at home, she couldn't even drink coffee in a hotel in New York. And at the end of it, my daughter just looked at me and she's like, Mom, I feel really bad saying this, but I'm really glad that I have white skin. And I was like, I know, we're really lucky, and let's talk about it. So then we talked about white privilege. And so everything is up for discussion in our house. And like Audrey, it kind of bubbles up and it'll come up when, they're deferring bedtime or brushing their teeth or eating breakfast or walking the dog. And so we just try to encourage that curiosity and understand that we're trying to raise adults that are going to go out into the world and hopefully change it by standing with people, not trying to take the mic and do it for them.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Allison. Emily, you've already mentioned that you are raising your family in Charlottesville, which has been at the center of a lot of stuff in recent years. And I wonder, but you live with your family out in Crozet, so which is a little bit different. It's kind of hard to describe that it feels very different when you're driving out and you're outside of Charlottesville. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what that's like for your children and how old they are, and kind of contextually what discussing white supremacy or racism might be for them, even though it's clearly very much a current event in Charlottesville and in Virginia right now.
So yes, and I just moved actually way far out to the country. So if you see my lighting is so bad, because we have no window coverings, we're living with bright light here. So Charlottesville has, it's weird growing up in a different location. My children are 6, going into 1st grade, and 8, almost 9, going into 4th. And living in Charlottesville and raising kids has been a stretch for me. I've been stretched to have conversations very bluntly. As Audrey and Allison said, really clear conversations with my children. So after the Unite the Right rally, when Heather was killed, she was the woman who was killed on the downtown mall by a white supremacist. We were driving into town and we were on vacation, and we were driving, and my husband always says he was so glad we were on vacation because he knows I would have been so unsafe, because I get so worked up in the situations, and I'm learning how to calm down. But we joined some friends who were doing some chalking. So the days after the rally were very tense in Charlottesville. I was still on vacation and was not in the office. My children were home, and I felt like I want to do something. We're having the conversations with our kids, but they were very stuck on that someone had been hit by a car. So we had a hard time explaining to them, like, the car was a weapon, like someone would use a gun. And it wasn't like we tell you not to ride your bike in the street hit by a car. This is someone was hit by a car to hurt them. And someone organized a chalking of the street. So we went early at sunrise, 3 days after the rally. And some of the work we did was we just wrote, like, we chalked the downtown mall as my kids were in that space. And then we took flowers to the place where Heather was murdered. And it was powerful. My son, who is 6, is a deep feeler. And he still talks about the man who killed her and asks, like, is he in jail? Like, what is going to happen to him? And he wants to know what justice is going to be served. And it's hard because not enough, like, that's what we have to tell him, like, not enough justice is going to come of this. And we have since then been very overt with how we talk about racism. My husband is a large white man, and we joke, but it's not funny. He looks like he could be a white nationalist. Like, you look at him and you believe he's going to fall into a certain group. He does not, but it means people say things to him that they might not say to someone who they thought was, you know, more progressive in their thoughts or not a racist. So he's often combating personally other white men. And we realize our son is going to look just like his dad, and he's going to have power. And we've told him that from a very early age, like, you are a white man and you have the power to hurt people. And I do a lot of work with consent, and that's been a conversation we've had with him, just that you will be larger than most people. You take up a lot of space. He has a big personality, but how it is your job to also get out of the way. It's your job to make space. And so those conversations have been important in our house. The idea that we have friends, a couple of his close friends are Black. And what does that mean? Like, what does it mean if someone's bullying this kid? Could that be different? Is that a different kind of bullying? And we're not figuring it out. Like, I don't know the right way to do that, but making him more aware that bias is real. And that's a word just within the past few months we're really working on, in that people look at a Black person and are making assumptions about that person. And that's been a big hurdle for us. Like Allison, we're trying to consume things and just normalize that, like, Black people are wonderful central parts of our lives. We're a big podcast family. And I'll say that the world is making it much easier for us. So you go on Netflix, and we started watching Free Rein. It's a horse show. We're really into horses right now. And the main character is a Black girl. But it even says underneath it, it was like, I don't know, it said something like, you know, promoting all voices or something about it. And I was like, thanks for making it so easy for me to pick these things for my kids. And we're trying to be more clear about that. But it's difficult. And within our school, there's not a lot of diversity. So there, in our new neighborhood, we drive through, and there was a little boy, and my son said, oh, he's in kindergarten with me. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's another Black family I didn't know about. And we came home, and I told my husband, and my husband was like, oh yeah, it's this. I know exactly who it is. Like, it's so limited in our community. That, and then I am trying not to be like, be friends with the Black kid, like, like, make extra friends. So we're trying to have the conversations about also violence. So we have a lot of conversations about the police, and like most kids in elementary school, they love that, like, police and power, and what does that mean, and how do we play that? So we are having so many conversations about how come the police are safe for us and not for other people. And I'm having to push against my own hard feelings about that, because the police have always been safe for me. So what does that mean? And how do we do that? And how do we use the power we're given to protect the people around us? So there's a lot of that. And also just some real things that we're working on is like, we don't tokenize our friends, and we also need to be aware. So I'm a children, youth, and family minister. One of my very best friends is Black in Charlottesville. She said, I'd come to your church, but I'm not interested in being the token like Black person at your church. And I'm like, I get that. And but her kids come to my vacation Bible school, and she said, like, I need to know how many other Black kids will be there. And I'm like, yes, you do need to know that. I don't have to think about that. But she's like, I don't want my kids to be the only Black kids again in a situation. So I'm trying to be a little more aware in those situations of doing the work for my friends before they have to ask me to do the work.
Thank you, Emily, for that. I think, as I hear you talking, it is in some ways easier these days, because when I was growing up, and to some extent when my children were small, every image in a film or a TV show, I mean, it was saturated with white people, and the bad people were always of darker skin. And so I think it does get easier, but then it also permits you not to have the conversations unless you intentionally set out to have those conversations. The closest thing that I can describe from my own life is in the Episcopal Church. It wasn't until 1976 that officially women could be priests. So I was 17 years old before I experienced my first woman priest, and I didn't like her. It felt foreign to me to have a woman doing the things that I had been so conditioned that men do. So I think that when children grow up with strictly, if they go to a doctor's office and everyone who's at the doctor's office, the doctor, the nurses, the staff, if they're all white people, but then the people cleaning up after them are not, that sends messages too that have to be unpacked a bit. So I wonder, would any of you like to jump in on how you manage the images that you've talked some about it, but those kinds of conversations about where you see white people only in positions of privilege, and how do you upend that for your children?
So I'll say, after everything happened in Charlottesville, my dear friend who's Black and always made to have to stand up and be the Black voice was in a panel, and I came to support her. And someone asked her, like, how do I interact with Black people? That was their question, which is a good question in Charlottesville. And she's like, I'm Black, I can't answer that question. And but what she pointed to, and it was what Allison spoke to, like getting out of our communities and joining. So we were clear, like I worked out at a gym that was a longer drive, but my kids were in childcare at the gym with a much more diverse community. I think you have to be intentional in that way of like picking yourself up. And my friend would say too, like, talk to me at the playground. That was her big thing. Like, nobody talks to me at the playground. The white moms will introduce themselves, but they won't introduce themselves to me.
Yeah, we've just had to be really intentional, and we have sought out, when we moved here, we sought out a pediatrician who was a woman of color. And we're about to move my son to a man, and are making sure we're moving him to a Black man who's a fantastic doctor. And it's just something that was unheard for me growing up. Like, that was just, I don't know that existed. And if it did, I definitely didn't know about it. And so we're just trying to broaden their horizons, but we have to work on it because of where we live. Like we could be as apathetic as we wanted to, because we would, like Audrey said, we never would have to talk about race if we didn't want to, because white is so central here. It's the norm and the default, which is not what I was expecting when we moved to Dallas.
Yeah, so I agree with both Allison and Emily and everything that's been said. One thing that comes up in Hoboken is that in the public schools, every higher grade, like, you know, going from kindergarten to first and first to second, like every grade you go up, there's more diversity and fewer white kids. And that is because there's like a massive migration of white parents fleeing to the New Jersey suburbs. And part of that's just people fleeing New York to Hoboken and then eventually Hoboken to the suburbs, but much of it is racially driven, and a sort of fear of diversity, frankly, right? And this sort of sense, you know, when it's kindergarten and you know 13 out of 15, you know, kids are white, and you know one's black and one's brown, everyone feels okay. But then we know by the time you get to, you know, ninth grade and those numbers are reversed, white parents tend to feel very, very differently. And this is discussed in Hoboken to varying degrees of explicitness. I have heard the phrase project children be used to describe, and that was last year at a party by a white parent to describe children of color in our schools here. Actually, I should say my husband heard it. I think everyone at that party is lucky that I didn't hear it, because I would have absolutely lost my cool. But anyways, you know, and so I bring this up because to me, you know, when you have parents using language like that, like I'm not even sure where to begin. But what I'm more interested in are the parents who talk about it in coded language, right? So they don't say, "Oh, I don't want my kid to be surrounded by children of color." What they say is, "Oh, I like the diversity here, but the test scores, but this, but that, but the curriculum." And what they end up doing, most parents, white parents, end up leaving Hoboken at some point, usually before middle school. Their kids are middle school age, and they move to the suburbs. And I think that, like, in terms of dealing that, one thing that I think is really hard, and I can see it in myself, and I see it as one tends to, I see it even better in other people. It's always easier to see the faults out there rather than in here, is a confronting of our own bias and prejudices and our own lack of valuing of diversity. Right, the idea that it's so expendable, right? I like diversity, but it's so much more important to have the academics be like, you know, top quality, you know, 10 out of 10 test scores, you know, at the schools or whatever. And you know, I think that one thing that's happening for me as my children get older and I talk to them more and more about how to be anti-racist is I realize how far short I am falling of that mark, and how much more work that I need to do as well.
Thank you for that. Yeah, the school situation in Hoboken brings its complications for sure. And yeah. So now we get to what may be the uncomfortable part of the conversation. We call it "Bring on the Cringe." Those things that you may have done or said or been to and with your children that maybe were not best, and may have been really not beneficial for anyone concerned. I know we've all made mistakes. We're all going to make mistakes as we try to make our way through raising children to be anti-racist. I'm going to start with Allison because I know you already mentioned the colorblind part, and I want you to expand on that a little bit for us.
Oh my God. Well, buckle up because I've got quite a list. So first, I said Josephine Brooks as the woman that was on the podcast. I didn't even get her name right. So Josephine Baker is who we listened to today, which, you know, just immediately makes me feel like she wasn't important enough for me to even get her name right. So immediately I go into like Audrey, like how much work that we have to do ourselves. I felt like when my kids were younger and we were teaching color blindness, you know, we made sure we had Bibles where all the people were different colors with dark skinned Jesus, and we had different dolls, and we had so much conversation about how every one of us was made in the image of God, and God named all of us as very good, and we are all the same. And, you know, race is a social construct. It's not even biological. And we were doing this. And I think by the time my oldest was maybe 4, I heard Stephanie Spellers give it was some sort of a speech that I listened to online. And she talked about how color blindness was really hurting the Black community, and why. And just the idea that teaching my kids to be colorblind, which seemed so radical for me based on my childhood, was actually a form of gaslighting Black people, because it was making them think that if we're all the same, then they must be imagining all of the discrimination that they're feeling, was completely earth-shattering to me, very humbling, and completely changed what we were doing. Lately, one of the things that I've realized is, Emily named it a little bit, but because our kids are in such a predominantly white school, and they always have been, we've talked about how life is harder for those few kids of color that they're in school with. And so they should be extra kind, and they should look out and make sure that those kids aren't being picked on, and to stand up and speak up if they need a friend or an ally, and have realized that that's like, it's a major form of tokenization. And so trying to figure out how to honor the person for being a person, and not just skin color, but also recognizing that their life is harder because of their skin color, and what it must be like to go through an entire elementary school without ever having a teacher who looks like you. And so I'm still struggling with trying to figure out that balance. And then another big thing is really where we live. We sought out a neighborhood in Dallas that had an elementary school and a middle school. So we wanted to not just be in a place where the elementary school had great scores and then everybody vacated and went to private school for middle school. So the middle schools tanked. We bought a house based on an elementary school and the standardized test scores, essentially, and it put us in a white neighborhood. And in the 3 years that since I've lived here, we moved here right after the Charlottesville riots. And in those 3 years, I've realized that standardized tests, like how racist they are. And that even though it felt like the best way to educate our bright, curious kids was in a school that had high test scores, like that's not the only education they need. And so we're in a great house and we love our neighbors, but also it's doing a huge disservice to our kids who they're growing up with. And so already thinking about if we ever move again, being more intentional about living in a very integrated area, even if the test scores aren't where we think they need to be, because the work that I'm doing now to make sure that our kids are exposed to other races is something that could happen naturally at school. And if they do need to have another type of higher math or something, we can do that at home. And that's easier for us to do than to try to teach them about systemic racism and white privilege just in a white context.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Emily, you have any cringeworthy moments for us to talk about?
I made a list because there's a lot. Allison brought up something for me that was so true, which is the shushing. So my son loves to talk about Black people right now, just like every day. Any Black person he sees, he wants to find out their life story and then wants to figure out why the system is broken for them. And as much as I appreciate that, the grocery store, I start just cringing. Like the other day, someone walked in and he's like, there's a Black person. Do they not make as much money as us? Are the groceries going to be hard for them to pay for it? I'm like, shut up. Like, are you kidding me right now? But then I'm like, well, I don't know about that person, but yes, for Black people, they do get paid less for jobs that we do. It's harder. Like we get into the conversation, and many years ago, which was totally different, I had a friend who had a spouse who died, and I'd said, well, I don't want to bring it up with your kids too much. And she's like, we're always thinking about it. And my friends who are Black have said the same thing. Like, we're not walking around not knowing we're Black. Like, we're aware. So if your kid says something, we're not shocked. Like, we understand. So I'm having to work on that because I shush him constantly about things like that, especially just noticing people. And I have done a lot of work around body image with them, and we don't talk about people's bodies ever. Like, we just don't comment. It's people's bodies are their bodies. So it kind of breaks my rule as a family of like, this is different in a way because this holds a different, because of bias, which we could say is with bodies too, but this is a more predominant issue. So we're going to deal with this because it's more important. So the shushing, we do have Black friends, and I like to pat myself on the back for that and be like, good job. Look at us white people with Black friends. And it is organic, and they are truly like some of our closest friends. But I don't like to see hard stuff. So we were hanging out with some friends who have biracial kids. And as we drove home the other day, there was a police officer who was in an altercation with a Black woman. I didn't see it because I don't open my eyes to that. And my partner pulled the minivan over, think good, he looks scary because the minivan isn't, and just pulled right up to the police officer. But that's something that I don't see. Like, I struggle to see police and register it still, that there could be danger. What else? Oh, and my favorite, one of my dearest friends, I asked her to sit on a panel at my church to talk about being Black in Charlottesville, to educate all us white people. That was about 3 years ago. And she super kindly was like, not my job. Nice try. And I was just like, oh my God, you're such an idiot. Like, why did you think that was a good idea? And that might be my most, just as someone I loved, and I felt like I put her in such a weird position. And I learned a lot from that situation, just about it's white people's job to educate other white people. And that's where the energy has to go. So that's just my immediate list as we talked now.
Emily, I did that 3 weeks ago to the
Great.
one Black priest in our whole diocese. And it's like, I know better. And I still did it. Like, it's that whole, and then like trying to like really prayerfully reflect on why did I do that? If I knew better than to ask her to do this hard work for me.
Yeah.
And then I'm not the Black
Audrey,
woman who's getting this all
Audrey,
the time.
you have any additions to this conversation?
So I also made a list. I limited my list to the last 3 months because, we don't have all night. I mean, it's a lighthearted way of saying that, like everyone, or at least let me just speak for me. Like, I've made so many mistakes and so many missteps. So 2 things. A couple of weeks ago, one of my kids pointed at my arm. It's summer. We've been spending time outside. I tan relatively well. I don't know if that shows up on Zoom, but anyways, so she pointed to my arm, which has gotten significantly darker than it was in, like February. And she said, "Mommy, your skin is getting so dark. Please be careful. I don't want you to become Black." And obviously we had to have a conversation at a future point about, how race worked, and that me getting tan, doesn't mean that I become Black. But I mean, that to me, that's a minor thing. That's totally age appropriate to misunderstand. But obviously the idea that becoming Black would be negative, that still is haunting me. And, it's one of those, obviously I tell her, that this would be a bad thing. Like, but that doesn't actually address the problem, right? Like, those are not the right words. So that's something I'm actually still struggling with. Like, I don't know exactly what I said or did to give her this idea. And it probably was not one thing. It's probably a whole lot of smaller things. But that's a hard thing to see reflected in your young child, right? Another thing that happened sometime in the last few months, quarantine life is beginning to like run together in my mind. I was out and about with my 4 and 6-year-old, and we like in town in Hoboken, and we came across a little person, someone of short stature. And my 6-year-old pointed at him and said, "Mommy, that is a funny looking man," and started to laugh. And he was justifiably upset, and explained to me why he was upset. And I mean, I apologize, and I still feel terrible about this whole exchange. And she had never seen someone of short stature before. But it had also never occurred to me in 6.5 years of raising kids to introduce that as a sort of thing in the world. And I think one thing that it made me realize is that there are so many variations on bias and prejudice, and it's important to not stop, right? To continue to try to identify, the ableism and all of these other sorts of things that sort of permeate our world and how we exist in it. So those are my very recent cringeworthy moments.
Yeah, it's really challenging. There's so many different circumstances that I mean, kids are going to say what they're going to say when they see something that is not something they're accustomed to seeing. And I was listening to a podcast. I don't know if you heard the Safe Space Radio. It was about talking to white kids about race and racism. And, one of the mothers on there talked about how her 3-year-old in a doctor's office waiting room or in a preschool room or something, a little black child said, "Come play with me," and the kid's like, "I don't play with black children." And the mother, of course, was horrified, but did not understand where this could have come from. Where does that kind of reaction come from? And it is as much about not talking about it, not exposing children. So what the mother said she did was she said, "Well, I'll play with you." And she sat down and started playing, much to the shock of her child. So there are various ways of handling such things. I wanted to see if anyone who is watching this on YouTube has a question. We have not seen any yet in the chat box. That tells me that we're saying everything you came to hear. If that's not the case, I'd love to have you put your question in. We'd be happy to answer anything that you might have. While we're waiting for that, I wonder if if any of you have particular resources that you're using right now, people that you're following who are talking about raising children to be anti-racist. Allison, you've already mentioned a couple of books, like reading Stamped, which it was an excellent book. I also read it, even though it's principally for young people, but I love the way it's framed in a much more accessible kind of a way. So I wonder if any of you have really good suggestions that we might be able to share.
I can share a few real fast, just like from Instagram. I've been following The Conscious Kid on Instagram for several years, and they post everything from books and movies to conversation starters to here's a list of microaggressions that you might not know that you've been guilty of saying or doing. And it has been really great. And then because we read a lot, I follow several Instagram accounts that help me with finding the right books to read. We Need Diverse Books is one account. Well-Read Black Girl is another account. And The Brown Librarian and The Brown Bookcase are all great ones. And that's been helpful. And I try to read a lot of those out loud with my kids. Like we read recently Ghost Boys, which is about a kid who was shot in Chicago. And then the ghost of Emmett Till came back to help him work through the child of the shooter, the police officer who shot him. And it's a kid, like it's a middle grade book. But I wasn't sure, even though we talk about police shootings and we talk about school shootings, what it would be like inside my son's head as he read it. So being able to read together and then to answer all those questions, or when the questions come up later, I have the context for what he's read.
Anyone else have any particular things that you follow, whether it's blogs, podcasts, books, anything else?
So That was excellent from Allison, and thank you for many of those excellent suggestions that I wrote down. I just wanted to sort of throw out something a bit more generic, which is, so we have a variety. We're also a very bookish family. Professor sort of goes with the gig. So we have books on, Rosa Parks and civil rights and all of this sort of stuff. But something else that's really important to me is also to have books that are just like about every other subject, like they're basically indistinguishable, except that they have characters that are not white. And like, obviously you don't only want that, like you want specificity and, context and culture in other books, right? But I think that both can be useful. So like one series that we really like for probably like a first to third grade readership is the Jada Jones series. And like Jada Jones, like a kid, she goes to school, she like gets like the class president, and she happens to be Black. We also really like the Yasmin series right now, which is sort of similar age and is based on a Pakistani American girl. So.
I'm a podcast consumer. So we listen to Rebel Girls podcast, and we love the Rebel Girls books, but they are short, and that's usually how long it takes us to drive anywhere is a Rebel Girls, and they are wonderful. And this summer, in distance learning, we got an assignment to listen to the Imagine Neighborhood, and it's kind of geared towards younger kids. It's all about big feelings, which we have a lot of in our house. So me included, it's been very helpful. But it talks about big feelings, but they have a special episode on race. It is phenomenally produced in terms of just speaking with kids and giving tangible, real, even mantras to use to get through things. But the race episode is awesome. And they always have professors and people that are child psychologists that write the show. It has been a lifesaver for us in this time of quarantine, but also giving us a lot of words to use when we're talking about race. It's been very helpful. And then, so because our dear friends are Black and are ballerinas, we follow Black Girl Magic hashtag on everything because it's awesome. And it's really fun to see just these beautiful Black girls that we want to help our friends. They followed it for a long time, and we've gotten into it, and we just love seeing, just like following hashtags of things that represent other people doing really cool things. And I just have to like shout, in Richmond, there's the most beautiful photo of two Black ballerinas in front of one of the monuments, and it is like Black girl magic to like the nth degree. And my daughter loves it. She wants it in her room now. It's like so powerful to her. So those have been our things. And like Audrey and Allison said, like these books, and I think reading aloud is huge, so they can process with you.
Thank you for all of those suggestions. One of the benefits of what's the time we're living in, particularly in the past few months, there are resources everywhere. If you Google resources for talking about race with your children, you will get more hits than you will know what to do with. And that's really good. It's good that these resources are there. I love the idea of normalizing whatever characters are in books or movies, that it's a normal thing, that it is that there are people of color, and there are Spanish speaking people, and there are Black people, and there are other people that aren't all white, and that's just part of normal experience. I think that makes a huge difference in how our children begin to understand matters of race. I also want to say, as we close, because we don't have any questions, that it is really important that we have these conversations. It's important to educate ourselves. It's important as adults that we educate ourselves, as well as helping our children to develop into anti-racist and ones who push back against what has been our life experience of white supremacy. And then we do have to do more. We have to work for issues of racial justice, economic justice, all of those things that we all in our positions could easily ignore if we chose to do it. And that is what perpetuates this racist world that we live in. So I'm going to encourage people, yes, do the work, get the facts, read, listen to particularly center Black voices about what their life experience is, and then get busy. There's always something that we can do using our voice, writing letters, voting, speaking up, teaching our kids to speak up on behalf of those who have not had a voice or are not able to speak up on their own behalf. These are really important things to do. Um, we do have a question, just one second. Oh, Emily, the name of the podcast you mentioned?
Unmute. Imagine Neighborhood. The Imagine Neighborhood.
Sorry about that. We are done for the evening. I can't thank you all enough for sharing in this conversation. For those of you who joined in, if you have more questions, you can certainly reach out, ask a question on the All Saints Hoboken Facebook page. You can send an email to me, which I'd be happy to forward to any of these women who spoke tonight. My email address is ethomas@allsaintshoboken.com. And we look forward to having many more conversations in the future about these matters, because it is something that we cannot ignore. We really need to keep pushing forward through our discomfort and make a change in this country finally. So thank you all for being here. I'm very grateful to you. Wish you many blessings. And again, thanks for coming.